So, at 20 minutes to 9 on the morning of December 13th, 1932, garbage collector Sebastião Barbosa finished his daily trash route in the Rio Comprido neighborhood of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Barbosa inspected his cart for overflow trash, and in doing so, he noticed a small but heavy object wrapped in yellow newspapers amid the rubbish. Upon unwrapping the item, Barbosa found a dead infant swaddled in an old blue dress. The 9th District Police Station, which held jurisdiction over the neighborhood in question, dispatched a police commissioner to the scene who took the infant to the Institute of Legal Medicine. Details are unknown as to how the police knew to question Maria Augusta, a young black native of Minas Gerais, which is a state northeast of Rio de Janeiro, who worked as a domestic servant for an immigrant family in the neighborhood. The only clue is in the investigation's final report, when the district's police chief wrote that due to the high probability of a crime and, quote, after various diligences, the mother of the infant was discovered, end quote. An autopsy of the infant occurred on December 16, 1932, 3 days after its discovery, and before the police knew to question Maria. Doctors cited cause of death as manual strangulation. While doctors had concrete evidence of an infanticide, which was legally defined as the murder of an infant within the first 7 days of life, police investigators did not know of this fact at the time of Maria's testimony. On December 31, 1932, Maria admitted to have given birth to a stillborn infant almost 2 weeks earlier. So it went, they found the infant, they did an autopsy, but the autopsy was not included in the police report, so when the police questioned Maria, they did not know it was infanticide. So when she gave her testimony, she said, quote, she felt that she was expelling some voluminous thing through her vagina, and on the floor fell an infant, that the witness did not feel move or cry. It seemed to not be alive, end quote. Maria told the police that the child had not been born alive, and that she placed its corpse in the trash. After performing a routine medical pelvic exam on Maria that ruled out induced abortion on January 2nd, the police decided not to take Maria into custody because they did not know the results of the autopsy. While the police did not officially accuse Maria of a crime, after being questioned, Maria did not return to her job. Instead, she took up residence at a boarding house. On January 8, 1933, at 7 o'clock in the morning, Maria Augusta committed suicide by lighting her dress on fire. The official cause of her death was cited as general second and third degree burns. Bureaucratic delays may explain the lag between the date of the infant's autopsy and its inclusion into the investigation. But, for whatever reason, the infant's autopsy was not included in the police report until after Maria's suicide. The final report concludes, quote, because there still had not been certainty of the existence of infanticide, she, Maria, was let go under supervision, being put up in 77 Rua da Estrela. There, possibly touched by remorse for the crime committed, the same committed suicide, setting fire to her dresses, end quote. We cannot take the police chief's words at face value because Maria never explained her actions in her testimony. However, the state clearly defined Maria's sexual activities and subsequent birth control methods, and I define infanticide here as birth control method, which is problematic in itself, but they defined it as criminal. In searching for how, when, where, and why women in early 20th century Brazil practiced varied forms of reproductive control, the available sources lead to both methodological and theoretical problems. To begin with, police archives are one of the few places where scholars can find mentions of actual instances of reproductive control, as these practices were most often criminalized. The only sources available on these practices, then, are marked as deviant, non-normative, and criminal. Thus, when researching reproductive control practices, I inevitably face the methodological challenge of defining deviance. How can I study the practices of abortion, infanticide, and child abandonment without reifying their supposedly non-normative status? In the end, this theoretical dilemma makes it imperative to uncover, decentralize, and describe the hegemonic institutions that created those categories in the first place. The use of archives as representative of official history presents other theoretical limitations. The criminal archive, in particular, when recording the interaction between deviant behavior and the state, also requires the deconstruction of official mediation, as shown in the police chief's insertion of his own opinion of regret into the motive behind Maria Augusta's suicide. Yet the lack of sources on certain historical groups present difficulty in looking anywhere else but at the moments when their lives cross with the state. Feminist sociologists and criminologists have shown that women often enter criminal records and proceedings as extensions of normal rules and practices. Scholars of male homosexuality in Latin America face the same dilemma. As historian Martin Nesvig writes on male homosexuality, quote, "The lack of narratives by gay men, the issues of filtration of sources through those who wrote about the objects of crime and sin, and the overall scarcity of material contribute to this dilemma," end quote. Scholars of homosexuality have followed in the path of gendered social history, which approaches the lack of documentary evidence on women's lives by looking at sources that record deviant behaviors, as this documentation often exposed the only time women appeared in the institutional record. As historians, how do we approach the explicit rejection of maternity by women if the only existing sources are marked as deviant? To begin with, this paper places reproductive control, here represented by abortion, infanticide, and child abandonment, within the category that historian Zed Tortorici calls non-reproductive sexuality, or, quote, other manifestations of unsanctioned sexuality, including masturbation, bestiality, male-male solicitation by priests, oral sex, sexual caresses, sexual witchcraft, abortion, erotic religious visions, sexually explicit paintings and drawings, and even possibly illicit statements and conversations, end quote. This definition allows us to look at a large body of social sexual practices without reproducing the hegemonic discourses that mark them as others. In his study of sexuality in colonial New Spain, Tortorici deals with the problem of institutional definitions versus actual beliefs and practices. He writes, quote, "In studying the Spanish regulation of sexual practices deemed to be unnatural, we are confronted by terms that are the work of a long institutionalized chain of reasoning going back to the early church fathers like St. Augustine and medieval theologians like Thomas Aquinas," end quote. Tortorici clearly explains the institutional role in defining normativity. We must unpack, define, and decentralize the institutional structures that define deviance. Here, the Catholic Church, to use these sources as, if not representative of larger non-reproductive trends, legitimate records of human behavior. In colonial Mexico, Tortorici explains, the sins against nature, which were delineated in social terms, this is quote, delineated in social terms as contravening the institution of marriage, were actually defined on a deeper level that took the procreative aim of sexuality as sexuality's true nature, end quote. I am not defining abortion, infanticide, and child abandonment cases as normative, as that would be imposing a different but equally limiting institutional definition on human behavior. But I am drawing these practices out of the realm of deviant and into a less clearly defined area of vernacular sexual and reproductive practices. Historically, these practices have been included within criminal studies. In contrast, I want to read these cases within the social, cultural, historical framework that unpacks the surrounding structural impositions. How have institutionally defined criminal practices been studied in Latin America? Historians have grappled with deviance and gender history for the past 3 decades. Steve Stern, in his study of domestic violence within indigenous and multi-ethnic communities of late colonial New Spain, writes that critiques of studying deviance in history cite that records privilege both non-normative individuals and deviant situations. Stern writes that, quote, often episodes of criminal violence represented not so much a rupture that stood apart from social dynamics, but an excess committed within a recognizable logic of behavior, end quote. Stern places domestic violence on the edge of, yet firmly ensconced in, a spectrum of normal behavior. Yet it is exactly this recognizable logic of behavior that I want to question. To fully understand historical practices or people that stood outside this logical circle, we have to reject not the presence of, but the authority of that circle in the first place. Additionally, scholars of gender in turn-of-the-century Latin America have unpacked legitimizing discourses precisely when the institutions producing them began to change, particularly in relation to class. In her study of prostitution in turn-of-the-century Buenos Aires, Donna Guy argues that social reformers gendered and classed notions of citizenship as a form of social control. Government officials linked inappropriate female labor with cash wages, as we saw with mediation, which went against liberal bourgeois ideas of proper middle-class families. Quote, married women who engaged in reproduction or production outside of the home for cash therefore had inheritance or business rights restricted, end quote. Julia Rodriguez, in her discussion of the scientific redefinition of the Argentine state, shows that scientists relabeled the terms of deviance and degeneracy to provide legitimate reasons for arrest and containment of immigrants. Quote, state officials called on scientists to define the boundaries of citizenship and to provide the theories and language of inclusion and exclusion for rewriting the nation's laws and policies, end quote. Nara Milanich, in her study of childhood and class formation in 19th century Chile, defines concubinage, which is when two people live together but are not married, illegitimacy, low nuptiality, female headships of families, child circulation, and orphaning as institutionally defined non-normative practices, yet widely accepted vernacular practices. Writes Milanich, quote, "It could be argued that a focus on illegitimacy, kinlessness, abandonment, and machismo, which is orphaning, overemphasizes non-normative, even pathological aspects of social practice. Far from displacing the state, it could be asserted, such a focus adopts the state's own moralizing categories," end quote. Unlike Stern, who accepts this hegemonic discourse, Milanich rejects the authority of the state to mark practices as deviant altogether. Milanich continues, quote, "As scholars of crime know, the non-normative often throws the normative into particularly sharp relief. Moreover, while these practices may have been non-normative, they were hardly exceptional. Illegitimacy was simultaneously unorthodox and among plebeians endemic," end quote. In Brazil, race notions of citizenship were just as important as class-based ideologies. Within the historical legacy of slave labor, class structures in 1930s Brazil were clearly race-based. Nation-states responded to issues such as domestic violence, prostitution, illegitimacy, and infanticide in class, race, and gendered ways that marked certain groups as deviant. So what institutional forces defined and judged Maria Augusta's actions? In terms of infanticide in particular, one institutional discursive force existed in the form of the honor-shame paradigm, which came from the Catholic Church's definition of sexuality as confined to the institution of marriage for the sole purpose of procreation. The honor-shame binary was rooted in the ideal of the bourgeois family, which saw men as the sole breadwinners of a legitimate nuclear household. Women who broke this pact by having sex outside of marriage and becoming pregnant had two accepted choices. They either had to marry their suitor or had to hide the physical signs of their act to maintain a pure sexual status, the economic capital for a good marriage, a good bourgeois marriage. Women who committed infanticide out of honor to hide their sexual transgressions continued to strive for the middle-class ideal. They were only rejecting non-bourgeois motherhood, and the patriarchal state viewed single mothers and illegitimate children as toxic. Women who kept their children but did not marry participated in the wrong form of motherhood, as we saw again with your paper. Women who committed infanticide without expressing shame, women who could not have children because they would lose their job, were rejecting motherhood altogether. In her study of deflowering cases of lower class, deflowering cases are women who brought men to court for taking their virginity and then not marrying them. Of lower class women in interwar Brazil, Sue Ann Caulfield found that women seen as independent in the public sphere often lost their court cases against suitors who did not marry their deflowered partners. Kristen Mujiero, in her study of infanticide trials in Argentina, found that, quote, "The legal consistency between the mid-19th and early 20th centuries infanticide cases is that women who killed their infants in, quote, normal ways and could demonstrate shame were tried under the infanticide law. Women who killed their infants in normal ways but could not demonstrate shame were tried under the homicide law." In Brazil, the 1890 Penal Code, which was in effect in 1933, clearly punished infanticide by imprisonment. Article 298 of the code cited official punishment as follows. Quote, "To kill a newborn, this being an infant in the first 7 days of life, employing direct and active methods, denying the victim the necessary care for the maintenance of life, and the impeding of its death, punishment, imprisonment for 6 to 24 years. Only exception, if the crime was perpetrated by the mother to hide her own dishonor, punishment, imprisonment from 3 to 9 years. Honor had a profound influence on the severity of criminal punishment. If a woman committed infanticide to hide her own dishonor, she faced a greatly reduced prison sentence. Here the legal definition of dishonor supported a bourgeois view of motherhood and the family. But were all of women allowed to show dishonor? Did a black domestic servant like Maria Augusta have a chance of proving her honor, or did she fall into the dishonorable category no matter her actions? What did honor mean to Maria, and how did the state, race, class, and gender this binary? In the end, when studying criminal cases for uses other than criminal histories, we must remove certain practices from the assumed normative logic of deviance. Defining these women's actions as deviant denies them central roles in their own lives. They acted within an institutionally defined logic that marginalized their choices, and we should not do the same when we resurrect their past.